NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, is a complex beast to say the very least, isn't it? Do you understand it? Well, I'm not sure that I do by a long shot. And as it has rolled on, things have continued to change. The federal government is planning on revoking planned changes to the NDIS for independent assessments for participants. Now, independent assessments would have affected, as I understand it, some 400,000 Australians who could have their NDIS services put under review and potentially cut. Now, that would be a dramatic change in this scheme. So, how can people navigate the NDIS effectively using the funding and support networks available to them, along with what changes the NDIS needs to make in the next little while to create a system that's inclusive and accessible to all? Well, River Knight is co-founder of Developing Australian Communities. He's a disability industry expert, and hopefully he can sort it all out and make sense of it for me and hopefully for you as well. Good afternoon, River.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Oh, look, it's great to have you because this is exactly what we need when we start talking about highly specialised subjects like this, River. They are complex and the nuances are many and varied. Now, before I start getting into that with you, just tell us a little bit about Australian communities.
So, what Developing Australian Communities does is we work all over Australia. We have a professional development body and we've launched some national surveys. We do research into the disability sector, but we create these huge spaces in each major city to connect participants and service providers. And we do a bit of systemic advocacy working with some of the issues in the sector. But our expos that we run, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, not Adelaide yet, but the ones that we do run around the country create these huge spaces to also provide free information for people that are really just struggling to navigate that NDIS space.
Oh, and look, I bet there are plenty, and that sounds like a darn fine thing to be doing, River. Any plans to start doing similar things in South Australia?
What we'd love to do in South Australia is the same sort of thing that we're doing in other cities. Unfortunately, the population's a bit of a tricky one for us, so we're going to have a chat with the powers that be there in South Australia and see if we can get a little bit of funding to just help pay for the cost of the venue, which is usually the biggest struggle for us. But yeah, we're very keen to get into South Australia and those other states.
Well, look forward to hearing you solve that particular conundrum. Now, what is the federal government proposing here? What do they want to do, and what could it potentially mean?
So when it comes to the independent assessment program, it's caused a bit of an uproar in the sector. At the moment, the consensus is that they're going to not push that agenda right now, but they're going to go back and have a look at things. The reason it was such an uproar is that, one, they're not an independent body because they're funded by NDIS, so they have the NDIS agenda, and the agenda seems to be to look at how we can spend that funding better and perhaps reduce funding for some participants, which makes things a little bit tricky. But I guess the biggest uproar and the issue that participants have come back to me talking about is that they already have a lot of these professionals funded by NDIS in their life, and that funding creates time for those professionals to develop reports and assessments, to make recommendations around what should be funded for an individual and what's important to that individual's life and case, and then say we've got an independent assessor who's another layer, another role to come in, doesn't know the person from bar or soap, does a tick and flick and simply disregards all of those reports and recommendations from the professionals that NDIS is already paying to be in the person's life, makes no sense whatsoever. And it also undermines those professionals that we're funding. So it's a waste of my tax dollars. And it does say a lot about the way the system's geared at the moment, especially with billions of dollars of underspend in the sector.
That just sounds like madness, like, flagrant waste of taxpayer dollars for reasons there doesn't seem to be any logic to it. I don't get it, River.
Well, A friend of mine, Sue, who has a young daughter with a disability who uses a wheelchair, she was in the pilot for the Independent Assessor Program to just trial it out. And the experience she had was that after that person, the complete stranger, came in, did a tick and flick, didn't know them at all, disregarded any reports, they came back with an assessment saying that that young girl doesn't have any mobility issues whatsoever. Now, this is a girl that was in a wheelchair at the time. So it
Right.
makes you scratch your head. So you sit there and go, for me, even though it's supposed to be an individualized program and the tick and flick system doesn't support that, the thing that really sticks in my mind is that if I have an OT or a physio or a psychologist already funded by NDIS to provide reports and recommendations, what am I saying about them if I want to fund another person to come in and disregard their assessments that I'm also funding through NDIS?
Well, it's
Does it
pretty
make a lot of sense?
disrespectful of those professionals, isn't it?
And it is. And I think one of the things we've suggested in the sector is maybe that's a great service for someone who has a disability, who's just had an injury. Maybe they don't have a lot of services in their lives at the moment, and they really need someone to just come in and help quickly process that application. I think that might be a really good way for them to access the scheme by having that third party that can just pop in and say, you know what, you don't have those reports, so I'll give you a hand. That would make a lot of sense. But for the majority who already have all of those services in place, it's just another level, and it just seems to smack of wanting to cut people's funding.
Well, I was going to ask you what your opinion was on that. I didn't want to put you on the spot, but it reading between the lines here, it just sounds like this is about saving money.
And everyone understands that. And I think in the disability sector, none of the service providers and the participants expect a gold Rolex watch to be funded through NDIS. We're not expecting the world, but those basic needs are really important to people. And we've got an underspend of billions of dollars in the NDIS budget already. So we can't use that as an excuse to bring in new plans. And I guess the thing with the Independent Assessor Program was that NDIS is structured so that it's supposed to provide individual support that looks at a person's situation, their background, their family, where they're living regionally or not, what state they're in, what access they have to services, and what goals they have in life. Not a tick and flick box that says, you know what, you match one of my pretend personas that I've come up that says that everyone with cerebral palsy who is at this age group probably should have this funded, and that's what I'm going to approve. And it doesn't make any sense because it means that we also waste funding because we're not actually saying, well, what's actually really important to this person this year as opposed to last year.
River, politics to one side, at the very basic, fundamental level, this is about trying to take better care of people, yet it sounds like it's anything but. It's being, in some respects, disrespectful of them, but asking them to jump through hoops that they shouldn't have to jump through, and just to make things a whole lot more complicated. When you're trying to care for people, this doesn't make sense.
And I guess the uproar that we see in the sector too is that as a population, and I'm a service provider, I'm a person with a disability, I care for a spouse who has a significant disability. I come from those different backgrounds, and I look at it and I think, the system at the moment set up, I guess, so that the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So if I can self-advocate, great. But if I can't self-advocate because I have a disability and a mental illness, I don't get the services I necessarily need all the time. So what we need to do is work smarter rather than harder. We need to make sure that every year, for example, I have participants that I work with that have, say, $500,000 in funding, which is huge compared to most people. But every year, the planner that I talk to doesn't seem to have any case history, doesn't read any of the stuff from the previous 4 years, comes in completely fresh, and we have to start again.
How frustrating would that be? We're getting some interesting texts coming through, River, and perhaps they actually say quite a bit in themselves. One says, we had an NDIS assessment in March and we're still waiting for the report. It's unprofessional and a disorganised service, says Karen. And another says that on the weekend, my brother told me that 2/3 of his blind daughter's NDIS funding went on admin fees. Is that conceivable?
It'd be hard to. I'm not sure how they would do that personally, because I know that within this sector, the profit margin within disability services sits more around 25%, whereas in aged care, it's sitting more around 40%. But I think what tends to happen is the funding's not used in a smart way. And that's where we need to individualise things, and that's why you need a local case person through NDIS that knows what they're doing, that's involved with the family to say, you know what, I'm not going to just fund you what my box and my tick and flick tells me I've got to fund you. I'm going to fund you what you actually need, because I see people funded for things they don't use because they didn't need it in the first place. And then I see people getting funding cut on things that are really critical. And I've already had several participants that I work with directly where NDIS planners have said, last year you didn't use as much funding getting people to help you go out in the community during lockdown. So that means that I'm not going to fund you this year because you don't need that, because you didn't use it. And, of course, the family sees red and starts abusing that NDIS staff member. And then I'm sort of in that neutral zone of going, okay, let's calm and say, you know what, that doesn't make sense, because they haven't been out in the community. We actually need to focus a little bit more on that and help them a little bit more to get back into the swing of things. So it's about doing things smart rather than hard.
Our listeners are really engaged with this, I've got to say, River. Julie has just rung in on 1300 222 891. Good afternoon, Julie.
Oh, good afternoon, Lee. I'd just like to say that the assessment tools that they were going to use were very poor, and I hope that with the new proposal that the government doesn't just use the same 6 tools that have never ever been designed to determine a person's funding.
And River, what's your reaction?
And I do agree. So the tools that they were using, they're kind of, I guess, geared towards standardizing an idea of a person, and it kind of takes away that understanding within the professional sector that you need to get to know a person to really understand what their individual needs are. And those tools are definitely not designed to find out what funding a person needs. They're an introductory to a person, and they're certainly not done, for example, best by a person that doesn't know the person and is also perhaps a graduate just out of university who has zero experience.
Wow. Okay, there is just so much here, and clearly with the text we're getting this afternoon, River, there are lots of questions. Unfortunately, we haven't got more time to explore those. But just before I do leave you this afternoon, do you have confidence that this is going to be worked through to a more satisfactory result than would appear to be the case at the moment?
I think the cynic in me feels that perhaps the fact that an election will be coming up in the next few years may motivate people. But I guess for me, the biggest thing that I think needs to happen is the community needs to become aware of how this sort of stuff works and understand that organisations and people with disability need to be at the table helping shape this, not being informed afterwards and then having to fight.
Hear, hear. River Knight, it's been really illuminating and educational to speak with you. It's great to speak to somebody who is so deeply connected and who has such understanding of all of these issues. We appreciate your time on ABC Radio across South Australia today.
Thank you so much.
River Knight, who's co-founder of Developing Australian Communities and, well, you've got to say, an expert on the disability sector here in Australia, not just South Australia. You're listening to Statewide Afternoon.